to our third episode of our mini-series, It's Time to Talk. Today I'm joined with the amazing volunteer Mikhail, and we've got two brilliant guests as well. So today's episode, we are going to be talking about how to normalise talking about losing a parent, which I think is super relevant to anyone, whatever age it is that you've lost a parent, but particularly to young people. So I will hand over to Mikhail to introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Libby. So hi everyone, I'm Mikhail, and I volunteer for It's Time. So I started because through work I met the founder, Dave, who's doing incredible work, like starting the charity and bringing everyone together to, hopefully make life easier for young people who lose their parents. And what my knowledge of the subject is firsthand, as with everyone who's working in His Time and all the founders and trustees. And so in my spare time, when I'm not helping with the charity, I'm a management consultant. So makes me very confident to speak about a broad range of topics. So
amazing. Thank you, Mikhail. And I'm Libby. I'm It's Time's marketing and operations executive, and I've been working here for just over 6 months now. Similar to Mikhail, I've got personal experience in this, and I lost my dad when I was 14, so I was at school, very difficult age to talk about it. I certainly didn't know how to talk about it for a long time, and my peers definitely didn't know how to talk about it as well. So so certainly a relevant topic. And just before we go into introduce our brilliant guests, just kind of a reminder about what this mini series is aiming to do. So we're hoping to just discuss different topics that can affect you after losing a parent, as well as educating through inviting brilliant guests such as Polly and Dan here today to share their knowledge and or any personal experiences that they may have. So should we go to Polly first? Polly, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Libby. So thank you so much for inviting me today. I think, yes, as you said, I'm a counsellor. I think with many counsellors, I started off with a totally different career. I was in the corporate world in engineering. And then about 10 years ago, I trained as a counsellor. I've done some work with Mind, the mental health charity. And also about the last 3 years until earlier this year, I was doing some volunteering as a bereavement volunteer for Cruise, the bereavement charity. And then alongside that, I've got private clients. So I had a combination of volunteering and private clients. So that's who I am.
Amazing. Dan, would you like to introduce yourself?
So thank you for having me as well. Nice meeting you all. And much like Polly, I'm a counsellor. I'm also an addiction psychologist, and I have a background working in prisons with young offenders in particularly, and also with female offenders as well. I've also forgot to mention I worked with Samaritans for a couple of years as a volunteer, which gave me a lot of insight into loss and bereavement. And I'm fully in private practice now, and I work with relationships, young people, and general issues that come up in therapy, like loss, bereavement, identity, and so on. So that's me.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm very lucky to have you both with us today. Mikhail, would you like to kick off maybe with our first kind of topic of conversation within this?
yeah, sure. So but first of all, the topic, so normalizing speaking about losing a parent and making this a normal part of your daily life. Like when somehow, I don't know why, but when you lose a parent or both, you end up meeting suddenly a lot more people that have experienced this. And then it's quite normal to talk about it because you all have a shared experience. But when you take this outside of that group, it suddenly becomes incredibly difficult to even bring it up. And like in my case, I would sometimes just like throttle it through and be like, hey, it's part of my life. I'm gonna talk about it. But then I couldn't help but notice that it does make it a lot more difficult to kind of build relationships and be seen as like a fun, interesting person, because people start to associate you as like a bit of a downer, or we should like tiptoe around certain topics, even they have nothing to do like with losing parents. Like people will then stop talking about their own families, their parents, siblings, and for most people, family is a huge part of what makes them. So that is kind of a bit of an intro to why we're doing this. I think it would be nice to kick off with more of less of a question, more of an idea that, you know, for young people, you know, for most people, most men, I'd actually say that it's very difficult to start talking about your feelings and start expressing, you know, grief, start expressing some signs of sadness, because sometimes there's weakness. And when you bring it to young people, it becomes a lot more pressing, this issue. So perhaps we can start by discussing, you know, how do you find the right environment and the right time to start speaking about losing a parent? How do you prepare the ground before you kind of jump right into it? So,
okay, so I think and I've thought about this question, if I look at my experience in private practice and working in prisons, I have found, you mentioned, Michael, how it is often difficult for men to, in particular young men, to talk about feelings that are, you know, they're quite vulnerable feelings as well. The experience I have is that talking about things that make you angry, which is an emotion, a feeling as well, is a lot easier for men, but talking about things that make you sad, make you feel abandoned and rejected is a lot harder than more vulnerable emotions. So in terms of starting the process, you know, it's great if you've got a therapist or a counsellor, but not everyone has a therapist at hand for a number of reasons. They may not afford it, or they may get 6 sessions, and after 6 sessions you're meant to sort of make some progress, or at least that's what some say. But what do you do after that? And I think when you are trying to talk about it, it's important to find, and this may sound like, you know, counterintuitive, but find the easiest person that you find that you can talk to. Begin with the easiest person that you can talk to, because from that you will gain a sense of how to talk about it, how the person in front of you responds. Because the reality is that if you start talking about it with someone that, you know, is really difficult, the experience may be negative enough to put you off from talking about it, which obviously isn't what we're trying to achieve. But I think starting with a person you find easiest, if it's not a therapist who's trained to do that, then family, a close friend, and then building from that. There is a, if I think about my own experience, when my father died, I remember people avoiding any conversation about death. They avoided talking about it. They didn't say why, but I got the sense that it was because they didn't want to remind me. And what I was left with, what I was left with was like, do you think I've forgotten that my dad died? I'm thinking about it all the time. You're not going to remind me of it, because that is all I'm thinking about. So, but I understand people's intention with that. They were trying to, you know, prevent me from being upset. But actually, what I needed to do, and was fortunate enough to be able to do, was to speak about it, to keep communicating how I felt. So yeah, those are just a few thoughts on that.
And I think, Dan, you talked there about people not being very comfortable with grief, and I think particularly in our society, we don't talk about death much. I think about other cultures that openly embrace death. So I think that's a first stumbling block, isn't it? And I think the younger you are, the less likely you are to have a lot of peers who are going through the same thing. So I think one of the starting points for me is about you saying talking to somebody so that you can start to feel more comfortable yourself. Because I think if you're comfortable, and also looking at how you're actually feeling, because I think if you can start to identify what you need as a person who's grieving, then I think it makes it a lot easier for you then to tell somebody else. Yeah, I think that's a starting point, certainly.
Definitely. I think it's kind of it's a horrible combination, isn't it? It's the taboo subject of death, and then the extra layer of that on it being a close family member, it being a parent, and then the extra layer on that, it being you being a young person. And yeah, there's certainly, I think, isn't, particularly if you're a lot younger, I guess, not much peer-to-peer support where you can maybe talk to friends at that age, but certainly as you maybe get older, certainly as I've gotten older, I've now got quite a few friends who have lost a parent in, you know, from like early 20s, late teens. And yeah, as Mikhail said, you kind of almost end up finding these people who have also gone through the same thing. So yeah, I think it's a whole combination of things as to why it makes it so difficult to talk about, but also, like you said, Dan and Mikhail, being a man as well, there's also then an extra layer on that, which I think is really, really important to acknowledge. And I know my brother and I talk about it so differently. And I think it's not just the age differences. He was a bit younger. I think it's also he's a man, and yeah, just deals with it in a very different way. So yeah.
And I think that's interesting when you're talking about you and your brother dealing with it differently. I think there's an expectation that because you've lost the same person, so two siblings lost the same person, a parent, there's the assumption that you'll be able to talk about it together, that you'll be grieving in the same way, that you'll have the same coping strategies. And often that's so not the case. And I think that can be really isolating. You know, the assumption is, I mean, I've certainly had clients that really wanted to talk about their parent. They wanted to celebrate the birthdays. They wanted to sort of include them in Christmas and holidays, whilst other siblings weren't comfortable with that, and their sort of coping strategy was to crack on with life, keep busy, and they felt really alone. And I think that's come as quite a surprise to a lot of people.
And they're all valid ways of dealing with it, and that's the important thing, that even within psychotherapy and counselling, there is this sort of belief implicit most of the time that actually you should talk about it and keep talking about it. And I'm not denying the value of that, but it's really important not to get completely blindsided by that, and to stop recognizing, if it stops you recognizing that other people deal with it differently, then it's a problem, because then we're sort of pushing for someone to have a grieving experience that may not be theirs. And it's really important. And I'm glad you mentioned, Libby, the different ways of grieving, because if you work with people long enough, you see that people experience it so differently. And the example I often think about is even the question, how are you, means something entirely different to different people. When I ask my mum, it's always about her physical health. You know, my knee hurts, I haven't slept well. When I used to ask my dad, it would be like, business is going well, so yeah, I'm good. It was always about how much money he was making. And if I asked my friend Alice, it's always, oh yeah, I'm meeting Lizzie and I'm going out with Sarah on Wednesday. It's always if something social is happening. If you ask me, I'm a therapist, so it's always about my mental health. How am I mentally, psychologically? So even such a basic question means something completely different to different people, let alone a big experience like losing a parent, a significant experience like that. It's going to be different, and it's okay for it to be different.
And I think
from what I've noticed is that your institution where you are, can be school, could be if you're a bit older, work, it does shape your experience so much. Because if you're in your early 20s and then you're at work, and for example, you happen to be in a great company that have kind of bereavement support, that maybe some of your colleagues are older, so they have the same experience, that they can guide you through it. Yeah. Then if school, like it's a chance. You might have a great teacher who can understand and can support you, or you can be someone who, for no fault of their own, is completely like shocked by the news. And then also when you're younger in the school, you don't control the narrative. You don't typically speak to your teachers. You don't speak to kind of the headmaster. Someone speaks on your behalf. So then you feel even more powerless that, now what they think happened may not necessarily the same thing that you think happened. And then, yeah. And usually if you look at a teacher in school as someone who supposed to kind of validate and guide you, and they're completely taken aback and look frustrated by the experience. And then as you grow older, then you find it hard to start talking about it, because your first experience talking to someone outside of your kind of immediate support group was that, and I get someone who was supposed to validate your feelings and guide you, like gave you a very negative kind of reinforcement.
I think, just to give some of my own personal experience. So I was 14 when my dad died, and it was the 3 days after we broke up for the summer holidays, and I was in year 9. And it was almost at the most awkward time, whilst it was so nice because I had the summer holidays to just have a minute. It also meant, and this was kind of before social media, I guess, and not that I would have posted it on social media, but I wasn't that as connected with my friends or anything like that. And it then came to, term was restarting, and I was like, I don't know how to tell people. My close friends knew, but your friends who you sit with in science, or your friends who you have lunch with but you don't necessarily text or see outside of school, I was like, I don't know how to even bring this up, but this huge thing has happened to me. And me and my mum had a meeting with my head of year, and she was actually amazing. She said, what would you like? And I was like, I don't know. I said, but I don't want people to look at me differently, but I don't want to talk about it, but I want people to know, trying to juggle all of that. And she said, would you like me to pull the year together, explain what's happened, and that, just so that people are aware? And I was like toing and froing. I was like, because at this age and at that age, you don't want to stand out at all. You just want to kind of assimilate with your peers, don't you? And not have anything that's making you feel any different. And I would hate people feeling sorry for me like that. Like, oh, poor girl. I'd be like, oh, like, please don't do that. But I also was like, the uncomfortability of someone maybe saying, because people knew my dad were ill, of someone maybe saying, oh, like, how's your dad? And me then having to bring that up, I was like, do you know what, I'm going to have to, which is slightly less uncomfortable, everyone knowing, and then hopefully me never having to speak about it. So that was kind of my experience, but it was so difficult to navigate, and it was very and then there were also some people throughout the year who had forgotten that my dad had died, and they would say something, and I'd be like, the uncomfortability I would feel of then, I'm not going to correct you, because how are you then going to feel when I say, oh, well, my dad, he passed away a few months ago, so that's a bit of a tangent, but I guess actually it goes really nicely into the kind of second thing that we were going to discuss, which was being prepared to not get the response that we maybe wish for. So could we maybe speak about that a little bit?
Well, I think just by hearing of your experience, it's a really good example of showing how that you end up as the bereaved person managing other people and trying to make them not feel awkward, and you're working out what you should be saying to support other people, when in an ideal world it should be other people supporting you, but it just doesn't turn out to be like that, does it? I think in that sense, if you can become comfortable with the situation, I know that's really hard, and obviously the younger you are, the harder it is, but it does then give other people permission to be comfortable with it, but not easy at all.
Yeah.
It isn't. I don't think there's an easy way to deal with getting the wrong response from someone, especially since the wrong response often involves saying something usually well-intentioned but insensitive. It could be something as, innocent sounding as, at least you had him in your life, or something like that, right? And we all know what is meant by that, but it's kind of almost, it can feel diminishing of your experience. And, it can be something like that. How do we prepare for that? I think managing our expectations of who we're talking to, most of the time we're just going to be talking to people who can't deal very well with the topic of death. You mentioned earlier, Libby, that it's a cultural thing, and I think it was you actually, Polly, who mentioned it being a cultural thing, and they are part of this culture where it is a taboo. We don't speak about it. We even someone who dies of cancer, we say they lost their battle with cancer, right? It's like, we avoid using the word, even in settings that call for it. So I think managing expectations is important. We can't expect the person in front of us to deal with it like a trained therapist, because they're not. And even therapists are going to get it wrong occasionally. And I think, managing our expectations, really seeing that most of the time people mean well. They're trying to either, rescue us or make us feel better, or deal with their own discomfort in that situation. But that's where, narrowing it down to the people that you find it most easy to begin with, because they're less likely to say the wrong thing. There's a reason why you find it easier to talk to them, and then building from that the resilience, and then going, actually, maybe this person isn't the right person to talk about it with, and that's okay. That doesn't mean they're not a friend. It doesn't mean that they don't care, but there may be a better person to go out with, or to go out cycling with, and to talk about that, and that's okay. I think that's important, managing expectation, and really understanding that most of the time people mean well.
And that's so interesting, isn't it? When you've got, death will affect all of us, and yet so many people are so uncomfortable talking about it. And also, I think as soon as anybody mentions death, you don't know what that triggers in the other person about experiences that they've had. So I think, yes, it's really important to, as you say, manage expectations, but also, as you say, seek out people that will understand, that will be nurturing, that will be supportive. I think a big part of sort of the grieving process and ways of helping is the storytelling. It's hearing stories, it's talking about memories about a lost parent, and sometimes that will mean going to their peer group, people that you wouldn't necessarily automatically associate with, so their friends. You might need to seek them out, and get some support in that way, because they might not actually be in your circle of friends.
Yeah. I really love that, Polly, because I think it, I guess, also kind of goes back to the point of us, whilst there's no right or wrong way to feel ready or when to feel ready to talk about it, but if you are wanting to talk about your loss, is being comfortable with talking about it. And that could maybe be starting off with talking about some nice memories, because that creates like a comfortability of, oh, I remember when my parent did this, that, oh my gosh, like goodness, and then that creates like a relatability with your peers who maybe do have their parents, and then it kind of reminds them, look, and I know it's, everyone loses parents at different times. For some people, they maybe can't remember their parent. So that's also obviously needs to be kept in mind. But for young people who do have memories with the parents or parents that they lost, is you had a parent. Everyone has had a parent, you know, it's whatever it looks like, whether it was a grandparent who looked after you, or, you know, a guardian or something like that. Everyone's had, touch wood, you know, someone who's kind of been that person to them, and you can connect on those things. And I guess and also they were a person who was alive, and so yeah, to be able to talk about them is really, really nice.
And I think the younger that you are that you lose a parent, obviously the different experience you'll have of them as a person, you might not know them as anything other than your parent. You might not, obviously as you come into adulthood, you will start to get a leveling off and start to see your parent as a human being, as maybe more of an equal. And obviously if you lose a parent when you're younger, you never get to see that side of them. So you might be able to get a window of that through speaking to friends of theirs. Because I think that it's something you're cut off from then. And also I suppose the younger you lose a parent, you don't necessarily get the opportunity to resolve conflict. Yes, of course, more conflict can be created when you're older, but I think the relationship you have with a parent, you know, particularly through teenage years, can be quite tricky. And if that never gets resolved, you get that the opportunity is cut off. So that's different from losing a parent when you're older.
Definitely. I think there's so many unique elements to losing a parent as a young person, whether it's as a young child and feeling maybe disconnected from your own parent that you've lost. I know, not to speak about my brother again, but there's a 6-year age gap between the two of us. So he was 8 when my dad died and was 6 when he went into a care home. He feels very differently towards him than me. Whilst I had little time with him, I remember him in different ways, and that's something that me and him have had to speak about, because there's been tensions there between us. And I think you know, feeling like, oh, I'm never going to be able to properly know him. Do you know, it's the future of loss as well, isn't it? It's not just what you've lost in the present, it's all the future things as well.
And of course all the big occasions that, you know, the younger you are, there are going to be more life events that parent is going to miss, be it exam results, a graduation, a significant partner, marriage, children. The list is endless, isn't it?
Definitely. Yeah, I think to also give room to when, so I guess when, say if you approach somebody who and you're hoping to open up to them, and it's maybe is more about the pain that you're maybe feeling, and you don't get a response that you're maybe hoping for, as Daniel said, you know, to kind of, and as you said as well, whilst it's a shame that as the bereaved person you're having to kind of take that responsibility to have that self-awareness and trying to see it like that, is definitely just giving yourself permission to feel angry and to feel let down, feel disappointed, and to feel angry at the burden that you've got to, you know, right, well now I've got to find someone else, and I've potentially got to open up myself to feeling disappointed and hurt again, but to try and find that person that I can talk to.
Yeah, I feel like it kind of brings everything together, just being self-aware and also being aware of other people. I think, reaching out to your parents, friends, their circle, can also grant you this level of added maturity, as opposed to talking to your peers. You can understand, hey, I'm 15, all my friends are full of emotions, things happen in their lives. I can't expect to be comforted, like if I just approach them, like it's not going to be pretty. But then if you go to someone who, you know, much older, has more life experience, maybe with kids of their own, then you can expect that added layer that they're better suited to the role of someone who could support you in that sense. And and it's okay to, again, down to your point, to speak to someone who is comfortable to speak to, and then formulate your approach when you go and approach people that perhaps are less comfortable to speak with. I think it is a great point.
Definitely, and I think really important point actually, the fact that, you know, speaking to someone older, speaking to someone that's, you know, maybe trained to speak about it is really important. So getting that perspective, that you can get that kind of insight, I think it's very difficult to get to that inside one's head, because we're just having our own thoughts and then more of our own thoughts and then more of our own thoughts, and there's not going to be a new perspective from our own thinking. It has to be, you know, in exchange with someone else, be it a group or an individual. And just to sort of use a personal example, if you don't mind, when my father passed, for years I would dream that he was still here. So in the dream, he's healthy, he's well, and it's all been a scare, he's doing okay, but he doesn't reply to my texts, he doesn't reply to my calls, but he's in touch with my sister. Like, they chat, they're really tight, and I'm like, why is he not answering? Why doesn't he get back to me? Like, what's going on? And through the process of talking about it, I mean, it's probably not that hard to uncover, but I wouldn't have uncovered it at 15 for sure. I actually experienced his death as abandonment and rejection. That's why in the dreams he didn't answer my calls, he didn't text me, but he was in touch with my sister. And it kind of like dawned on me that even although I knew intellectually that he hadn't rejected me and abandoned me, on an emotional, primal, or even subconscious level, that's what it felt like. And just having that realization was so helpful. And again, as I said earlier, I don't think I could have arrived at that, you know, 13 or 14 years old.
Mm-hmm. And I think the question that most people come to counselling to ask about is, am I doing this right? Yeah. Or they come to counselling because they say they're not coping. And when they start to list the reasons they're not coping, they will start to list things like, as you say, feeling abandoned, not sleeping, loss of interest in things, loss of motivation, anxiety, lots of symptoms that aren't initially, you expect somebody to cry, you expect somebody to be sad, but when people start to have these, can be really, really strong emotions and feelings and responses to grief, they think they're not coping, and actually it's just a very normal response. And as you say, it's trying to work that out, and maybe that helps talking to a counsellor.
But I think, yeah, you do have to manage your expectations, not only what the right approach is or what the right response is, but also that, again, Polly, Dan, you're trained professionals, so I'm happy to be challenged on this. But I think you also have to slowly understand that it's never going to be the same, and you're not going to be suddenly magically fixed for the rest of your life. You might feel great on day to day, and you might, you know, have a great counselor to help you get through it. But once in a while, you'll still feel down. Like, someone will bring something up, you will just see something that is completely unrelated, like Mother's Day's flowers advertisements, and that will really set you spiraling, maybe like 20 years later. So yeah, if you think, oh, I'm not doing this correctly because like 10 years later I'm still feeling down, well, there's no correct way to fix this. It's what's done is done. Absolutely.
And your life is changed forever. I think one of the models of grief, how it's looked at now, it's not a case of getting over it, because that used to be the view. You will get through grief and then, you know, suddenly you'll be fine. I think one of the views is more that when somebody dies, you've got this sort of huge black hole in your life, and the pain, the grief, the sorrow, and it isn't about that getting smaller. It's more that over the time your life expands around it, so it becomes a smaller percentage of your life. But that pain, as you say, if you access it, it is still just as bad as it was initially, but it becomes a smaller percentage of your life. So I think that perhaps links into what you say, that you can tap back into that 10 years later, 20 years later. Yeah.
I've heard that analogy before. I think it's the perfect one. I've heard or read lots of different ones, you know, time is a healer or certain things, but I think that's the for me anyway, I think the right way to describe it. It's not that it gets smaller, it's that your life just gets bigger because you're getting older and you're having more experiences. So yeah.
That's a really good analogy, actually. I really like that. Yeah, and I think, you know, we hear, like, you know, 5 stages of grief, and it just sounds like such a perfect model, and it must be true, right? Because people say, who says there are 5 stages? You know, not everyone goes through denial. Not everyone gets to acceptance of it, and it just feels like that's the way it is. These things become part of a, you know, common parlance, and then we just think they're true. And it's really important to just look at the individual's experience, look at your own experience and what resonates, and that idea of your life actually becoming bigger and that pain always being there is something that I think resonates, and it's really valuable.
And you say it's not this neat path that you go through. Yes, you go step 1 to 5 and then everything's sorted. It's so much more erratic, isn't it? Swinging from you know, feeling okay one day, then back into the sorrow and the loss the next, then it's moving, it's, you know, like a pendulum swinging backwards and forwards, or a pinball machine, just sort of off all these different things.
But we love a structure and a model, right? An illustration of a human process. And it doesn't always work. Some ideas are good. There's an idea in psychologists often make a distinction between primary suffering and secondary suffering. So primary suffering is a given part of life. You lose someone you love, you are going to be experiencing pain and suffering, sadness, loss, grief. That's primary suffering, and that isn't something that needs to be medicated or treated or you know, therapized. That's not something, I know that's not really a word, but it's the one that came up. So that's not something that needs treating, and that's a mistake sometimes that we sometimes make, is that trying to treat something that isn't a condition as such. That's a human experience, and it's a natural response to losing someone you love. Secondary suffering is the part that we add to it. So that's mostly the story that we tell ourselves. So that could be, I was a terrible son, I got angry at my father way too often, I was ungrateful. You know, if it's a relationship breakup, it could be, I'm never going to meet anyone, I'm going to die alone. These are not part of the situation. Those are our own sort of inputs, and they're understandable, but it's sometimes helpful to recognize what is actually genuine suffering and what is secondary suffering. It's genuine as well, but it's not the actual core of it. It's the stuff that we're adding to it, coloring in, joining dots, and often that suffering takes longer to heal, because it's constantly being revised and it's constantly being interpreted. So it's sometimes a distinction I mention with clients experiencing.
And that's really helpful, because then that's back to normalizing grief, isn't it? That this is how it's likely you will feel, and it's okay. And of course, another thing is you can't bypass it. You have to go through grief. And I know it's such a cliche, but you can box it away, you can try and hide from it, run from it, but it will keep coming back. You have to go through it. And I think just by saying this is how you are likely to feel, that is helpful, just in normalizing it.
Yeah, it's true. And even that reference you made earlier, Livia, time is a healer. This is something people say, and actually no, time can make it worse. It's what you do with the time that actually matters, right? How do you engage with that time? You can have a resentment with someone, and 30 years later it's stronger because it's been fed over 30 years, or you could have moved on from that, you know, within a week or a year. So it kind of, time doesn't have any quality. It's what we do with that time that matters. So even such a sentence that most of us would just take for granted, like time is a healer. Oh yeah, that's true, but it's not necessarily true.
I really like that. It's reframing it, because it's saying it can. I don't completely disagree with the statement. I do, within reason, kind of some of it, part of it does resonate.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
But it's not as as clear cut as I think as when it's like thrown around as, you know,
Yes.
and to be there, and yeah, as you said, that's so true. You might be 30 years on from losing your parent, but you know, and this isn't to say that you have to throw yourself into, you know, feeling fine about it and all this kind of stuff, but if there's been no kind of, you know, I guess looking at what you've lost and the pain and the hurt and all of that, then you might feel worse. Slowly over the years, you might feel worse. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And what's behind the pain as well is the only reason there's pain is because we loved and cared so deeply. An alternative universe would be one in which we don't feel that pain. And what would that mean? It would mean we didn't love, we didn't care, and actually there's something very wholesome behind it, something very vulnerable, but also very human and wholesome and loving.
I've heard that before, and I really like that kind of phrase of, you know, the reason why it can hurt so much in the context of this is because you've lost someone that you loved, regardless of also the complicated relationship you might have had with a parent, because I think that's also very, I think when you've lost a parent, there's this presumption, you know, you've got massive, and it's like, it's not always that simple. You know, there's all these difficult things that can happen, but you know, often regardless of your relationship, like, you're going to feel the pain because you loved them, or because there was a sadness that I wish we could have resolved that conflict, you know, and all that kind of stuff. So does anyone want to add anything else? Or
just think it's really interesting when you say there that people will make assumptions, won't they? I've certainly done that with clients when they've come in and made assumptions. Thankfully, just in my mind, I didn't vocalize them, but they were sad that person had died, and that's the norm. And yes, obviously a greater percentage of people will be sad, but there are some people that won't be sad, or as you say, there will be a mix of emotions. And I think that can be hard to be on the receiving end when people assume that you are 100% sad. And sort of not acknowledge how complicated grief is.
I think the more, even like with this charity, as we are beginning to grow, you know, we're realizing the nuances and the subcategories of how people lose a parent or a guardian or someone who, you know, was that person to them. It's so complicated, and it's so you know, down to how you lost your parent, you know, that's a whole added layer of things. And just that there's so many factors that impact your experience of grief, of losing a parent. And I think just to kind of, I know we have touched on it before, but to kind of, I guess, address the thing of how, like, when you're a young person, losing a parent can make you feel alienated when it's the one time that you just really want to fit in with everybody. I wondered if you guys could maybe share, as qualified counsellors, professional counsellors, why is it so important for us as humans, but maybe particularly as young people, to be able to relate to people and to not feel different, and why that can maybe cause an added layer of difficulty for young people talking about it?
So it's a very well researched area in psychology and psychotherapy. So the need to belong is a basic human drive. So regardless of age and gender, it's very, very instrumental that human beings have a sense of belonging. The sense of belonging fosters positive psychological qualities, and the sense of alienation does the complete opposite. I mean, it is a form of torture, right? Isolation is the worst, and I think a lot of it has to do with our sort of basically our evolution and DNA. So we have evolved in small hunter-gatherer societies of like 150 to 200 people. So actually being alienated or rejected is equivalent to basically dying, because you couldn't survive on your own. And they've done some studies where they show that the part of the brain that lights up when we feel rejected or alienated is the same part of the brain that is associated with physical pain. So the article ends with saying rejection literally hurts, and it kind of really sort of captures people's experience, right? It's really painful to feel alienated at any age, but when you're younger, it is even harder. I think talking about it, again, it comes back to talking about it, and what you guys are doing is great, because it gives people a platform. You mentioned your forums and so on. It gives people a platform to actually sort of humanize their experience. It universalizes it. It means it's not just them, and it works with that kind of perspective, works with, you know, fellowships like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. But the thing that really works is the fact that people realize they're not alone, that other people feel and think like they do, and that sense of belonging is psychologically positive. So I think really going back to finding the right people to talk about it, it is a shift in your identity, but it doesn't define you. Losing a parent isn't everything that you are. You know, you're still at that school, you're still a friend, you're still a sister or a brother, and there's so much to you. But I think belonging, fostering a sense of belonging is really important, and charities like yours is a really good way for people to re-engage with that sense of community and belonging.
Yes, and I think what's so important, you're talking about like teenage years, particularly losing a parent. That's the time when you are sort of naturally moving away from belonging to family to then belonging, creating independence, creating your new tribe. So to be alienated at that stage obviously makes it so difficult. And I think, Libby, you also mentioned about the mode of death. Is it a socially acceptable death if somebody died for illness? But if it's something like death by suicide, maybe death through alcohol abuse, drug abuse, that again adds another layer of, I suppose, you know, it's socially acceptable, and another reason why people are going to be more reluctant to talk about it. So you've got that added layer. And I think absolutely right, you're down in particularly in those cases, finding your tribe, finding the people that understand. And just so you haven't got to explain everything, there's such a peace in being amongst people that just know. They might not have the totally same experience, but there will be elements. And I think that can just give you the breathing space to really start to work out how you are feeling and how you are coping.
Yeah, the image of like separating from one tribe and building your own, being just spot on.
Definitely. I think that's one of the things with our online community, where this will be posted, is long term we're looking to create different groups within the communities of, yeah, perhaps different modes of how someone lost their parent, and because, yeah, there's groups within that, and then different people can connect, you know, on those levels, but also knowing that they're part of a wider community of people who have lost parents. So yeah, I feel like that, yeah, without promoting our charity too much, I feel like, you know, and it's why we exist, it's why, you know, the trustees set it up, and why, you know, yeah, why people, I think, feel so connected to it. You know, everyone who either volunteers, or is an employee or is a trustee, we've all lost parents. So I think, yeah, there's, even with our little small community, like in the meetings we've had, Mikhail, you know, with like the rest of the team and all this, there's just a knowing, just a sense of, you know, different experiences for sure, but there's something that ties us together. And there's actually something when you find that community, or you maybe find a couple friends who, like the friends who I have who have now sadly lost a parent, there's just an, as you said, an ease of, you know, certain things. And that's actually something that's really special, because it can connect you in new ways to people that you might not have connected to beforehand, or you had a friendship with, but then it's like, actually, we've got this thing that we both get. Even if we go out for a drink and we're not even talking about it, but we know that there's that, you know, relatability there, I guess. Does anyone want to add anything else, or?
No, it's just been lovely to be a part of this conversation today, and I just think it's a super organisation that you've got, the charity. And you know, we started off at the beginning saying it's about finding the right people, it's about finding the right information, it's about meeting the right people, and obviously your charity is doing just that. So it's been lovely today. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just feel we could talk about this for another hour, and we still wouldn't do the topic justice. There's so much, even what you just mentioned about, you know, how did they die? You know, there's a whole different experience. Was it a socially acceptable way of dying, if there is such a thing, or not? And if there isn't, then how do you communicate that? How do you deal with that? And that in itself, you know, could be another podcast. So it's been so valuable and a real privilege to get the opportunity to speak with you.
Well, I think we'll continue doing small projects like this, you know, other mini series and everything. And it would be amazing to have you, you know, back together or separately or individually to talk about all of the other things that definitely come up about, yeah, through losing a parent. And yeah, it's been so lovely speaking to you both and all of your insights and everything. And yeah, I'm really excited to share this episode, because I feel like this is a really beneficial one.
Yeah,
Great.
it has been great, and thank you again for your time. You know, it's recording on Monday, so you're starting your week with us. So it's been really privilege, and yeah, it's been great talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.